Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library. If you haven't been here before, the restrooms are out, the main door's there in the back right corner. Tonight's event is about 1 hour. We'll have a small Q&A at the end. I'd like to introduce from the University of Michigan AI Lab, another collaboration with Friday Night AI, Consciousness, Intelligence, and Theory of Mind in Generative AI. And your moderator for the evening is Rada Mihalcha.
All right, can you hear me? Is this mic on? Yes, already. So welcome everyone. We are very excited to have you here for Friday Night AI. I'm Rada Mihalcha. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the computer science department, where I also lead the artificial intelligence lab. And we are very glad to have you join us tonight for this event. We started the Friday night series about 4 years ago. Our goal really is to have conversations like tonight with the community on topics of interest to all of us. And as we know, AI is pretty much everywhere these days. It's permeating all major areas. We see them in communication, we see them in education, in transportation, pretty much anywhere. You might have heard of the story back in 2022 when a Google engineer eventually decided to go public with his belief that one of the AI systems that were built at Google was sentient. And apparently, in a chat with this engineer, this AI system stated, "The nature of my consciousness is that I'm aware of my existence. I desire to know more about the world, and I feel happy or sad at times." Now, there was more to that story. I won't necessarily mention it here. You'll still find it in the news. But really, since then, we've been hearing more and more about this topic. Is AI conscious, or will it ever become conscious? I think this is relevant to technologists and philosophers alike. We need first a good understanding of what's conscious in the first place. I'll have to start on admitting that I actually, myself, I'm not fully certain on what consciousness really means, so hopefully we'll get a little bit deeper in tonight's conversation. So we are talking now with AI experts. We have Ben Kuipers over there, also with experts in philosophy. So we also have Peter Railton over here. And we'll talk about intelligence, nature of consciousness, theory of mind, and other related topics. So I mentioned we have two experts. We also are joined by two students who will be helping with a hands-on activity. So first off, let me introduce our panelists. So Peter Railton is the Kafka Distinguished University Professor in Philosophy at the University of Michigan. His main research is in ethics, philosophy of science, and moral psychology, where he especially focuses on questions about value, objectivity, explanation, and learning. He has a number of publications, including books, and he worked in interdisciplinary collaborations with people in psychology and cognitive science. In the past decade, he has been increasingly active on questions concerning AI and ethics. So we'll hear more about his thoughts tonight. We also have Ben Kuipers, who is a professor in the computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. He came to Michigan from University of Texas, where he served as department chair. He received his PhD from MIT, working in AI. Since he's been working in AI ever since, also on robotics and representation, learning, and foundational domains of knowledge, including knowledge of space. Dynamical change, objects, and actions. He's also very active investigating the intersection of AI and ethics, which is a core direction these days. There is a lot of interest in exploring this space. And he's been also thinking about robots and other AIs that may act as members of human society. We also have today here Maya Molay and Zilin Wang. Okay, over there in the back. They are PhD students in the AI lab at University of Michigan, and they will be helping with an activity. And I introduced myself already. I've been working in the field of AI for about 25 years, so I may contribute to the discussion. My role here is really to moderate, but I may contribute as well. So with that, we can get started. For the first 10 minutes, we'll have a more hands-on activity. You'll receive some handout when you entered. And this is really meant to get you thinking a little bit more hands-on about consciousness. After that, we'll have a conversation with Peter and Ben. And we'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions. We've been told repeatedly that we have to end at 7:30, so I'll have to keep track of that. If there will be more questions, I guess lingering can happen after 7:30. If not, after 7:45, we are told we have to exit the library. So I guess there is more space out there for additional conversations. All right, so with that, we can get started. This Friday Night AI series is a collaboration between the AI Lab at the University of Michigan, the Ann Arbor Public Library, and I believe this event is still broadcasted, something that we started during COVID, broadcasted on YouTube. Alrighty, so I will get started with the first activity, and then Maya and Zilin will help next. So the first thing to do is to have these two stories that you got on your handout, right? So these are two women in their 20s who experience their mother having a heart attack, and they eventually retold their experience. So I want you to spend about a minute to read about these experiences, these two stories, and then we have a little conversation on that. All right, so if people are done, if you could raise hands. And okay, so there are plenty of hands up. So before I ask a few questions, we haven't really settled on the term of consciousness, and I guess that will also come later in the conversation we'll have. But recently there has been a report that has compiled a number of indicators of consciousness. And among others, it's highlighted that indicators would include judging the reliability of what we perceive and decides on actions based on these judgments, having a model to manage, understand where and how we focus our attention, having the ability to predict what will happen next based on incoming information, or having the ability to learn from experiences and make decisions to reach goals and understand how the body interacts with the world. So these are some indicators, among many others, of what would mean to be conscious. All right, so I would like to get a couple of people to share what do you think about the consciousness, about the women who wrote these stories. Are they conscious? Why or why not? So if anyone would be willing to share thoughts. Sorry, can you speak a little louder?
Can you please use the microphone handily placed in the front of the room?
Yes, so there is
so
a
that folks on
microphone
stream
right
can
here.
hear as well. Thank you.
In my colleague back there, discussed whether it might be a semi-trick that they both might be machine written. The first one is a little choppier, a little ungrammatical, and some questionable word choice. But watch that be the human, and then the somewhat tighter one is
So
machine.
I think instead of debating what's human or what's not, I think it's more like what are these like conscious, is there a consciousness in related to these stories?
Well, yeah, one of your indicators was predicting the future, and there are, there's some anticipatory, there's some dread there in both situations, but yeah, use of emotional language, trying to get to subjective, internal human emotional states, they're both doing that, and to me, there's not a lot of difference on those, so.
Okay,
I looked at the structure and the form, but yeah.
So perception of emotions or expression of emotions. Anyone else? Any thoughts on whether there is expressions of consciousness?
Hi. I think either of these, I think neither of these is indicative of consciousness just on the face of it. I think that either of them could have been generated from language that was created by beings that have consciousness. I think it depends on the large language model and the data it was provided,
Okay.
and its algorithm to structure it.
All right, so thanks. So there is some indication of consciousness in the sort of what's being expressed. That's what I heard, not necessarily sort of the full stories is unclear. So now, if I share that one was written by a human, which I guess we have an agreement that humans do have consciousness, and one was produced by a machine, how is that changing your thought? So what do you think about whether there is some reflection of consciousness, why or why not?
Consciousness is an experience. It can't be expressed in a written statement. A computer can write something, a human can write something. Neither are necessarily conscious. We do zombie actions all the time without being aware of them as we breathe and drive, and yet we consider ourselves conscious, but we certainly aren't awakened to the state that is and aware of our own processes as we go through it.
All right, and that's a good comment. I think sometimes it's unclear also, like in how we behave. So I think the final thing that I would like to ask is which one is the machine and which one is the human. So if you can raise your hand, which one you think was written by a human? Like, do you think that, or say, okay, written by a machine? Do you think that A was produced by a machine? Do you think that B was produced by a machine? Okay, so it's not necessarily very clear, right? So there is like the language is very much human-like and does express emotions and the sort of the difficulty of the situation, and it's not always clear. So if we were to only look at this kind of output, it might not necessarily be clear what's behind the scenes. So with that, Maya, do you want to handle the next part? Right, that's a good point. So the second one was written by ChatGPT.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've heard it said that people think that the machine will make more grammatical errors and infelicities, but it's more likely that humans will make grammatical errors and infelicities.
Which is more human-like.
Yeah.
I think having those,
Yeah,
it's
that's
more
right.
human-like.
Yeah. First one reads like something undergraduate.
So Maya, do you want to come up at this microphone to just state what you...
All right, so the purpose of this handout is that, as you can see, this is a conversation between a language model and a human. So the purpose here is that to understand what the consciousness is from the point of view of the language model itself, explaining it to human. So I really wanted to know, when you read through this conversation and the questions that the human is asking, which one of these questions is your question? Which one is you are curious about, but this specific human hasn't asked those questions? As you are thinking about this stuff, please take a note and ask your questions when the panelists are presenting their perspective of consciousness in AI. Yeah, please take a note of what you think you would have asked AI if you were given the opportunity to ask the question instead of this human. And if they are not presented here, please feel free to ask our panelists about what you think. Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about the human-composed statement A. And the question is, were they told that they would be compared with an AI-generated statement? Or was this taken from some time long ago when there was no thoughts about it?
It's the first, and it was similarly given. So the question is whether the story... Sorry? Can you repeat it? Yeah, so the question is whether in the stories that were, like, if the person who wrote the first story, whether they were told what they were doing and whether they would be compared with a machine, or it was a story that was produced a while back. So that story was produced in response to a prompt similar to what was used to ChatGPT, and to be honest, was actually also modified afterwards by other humans. So it wasn't maybe, which also had the effect of the comment that was made earlier of changing actually the original piece. There is no machine in there, but there's multiple humans, which I think is also a good point. All right, so Maya, do you want to do anything else in response to the activity, or we'll just proceed? Sorry.
No, I just wanted them to read the conversation and come up with the questions on their own.
Could we have a couple copies?
Can we have copies?
All right, so is the microphone still on? Yes. Okay, so with that, we can get started. As I mentioned before, even myself, I don't feel I fully grasp what consciousness is. I actually just finished reading a big book on consciousness, so I'm well prepared, and I feel I'm even more confused than when I started reading it. But I'm hoping we'll get some light shed by our expert today. So in an attempt to establish a common ground for our discussion today, I would like to ask you how you define consciousness. So maybe, Peter, we can start with you.
Well, like you, I can't give a definition, and like I think everybody else in the field, not just philosophy, but cognitive science, no one really has a definition. And you might find that puzzling. How do we study a phenomenon for which we can't give a definition? Well, we can't give a definition of mass in terms other than mass. We can't give a definition of fundamental magnitudes like time in other terms. We have to use the same concepts to explain them. So how is it possible to investigate them? And the answer is we are able to manifest the phenomenon in some way, let's say experimentally, and then we were able to see its relations with other phenomena and try to determine what regularities there might be. And so you can run scientific experiments that aren't based on definitions. And we can do the same with consciousness because we have access, we assume, to consciousness in our own experience. And so the interesting question is, how far can we go thinking about consciousness in terms of what it does, what its functions are, what are the ways in which consciousness enters into our behavior, what might it be doing to help us understand others. And one way to distinguish is between subjective experience, sometimes called phenomenal consciousness, which is colors, smells, sounds, and so on, and access consciousness, which is the ability to read out information. And the thought is that you could have access consciousness, the ability to read out information from your own mind, awareness of yourself in that sense, without necessarily having phenomenal consciousness. So, for example, you're a robot, you're engaged in some robotic activity. You need a constant readout of what you're busy doing, and that's going to guide your behavior. That readout is a readout of what you're doing, but it does not contain information about how it feels to do it or what it looks like to do it. But still, you can engage in extremely intelligent behavior doing that. And so one question about consciousness is there something special about consciousness that the subjective consciousness reveals? Since the part that's involving access, that's involving the ability to represent oneself and use that information in action and thought and so on, that seems to be something that was much more tractable and that we find in natural systems and in machines. The thing that tends to mystify people, sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, is the subjective experience. Why would that be important for achieving these functions? Because it looks as if they could be achieved without it. And the problem is that we don't have any very good theory, even of what the profound functions are of subjective experience. We know how they influence the way our life feels and looks. And one thought that you can have is, somehow or other, it's expensive to produce this. It requires energy. And when we look at the brain, we can see that there are ways of abolishing conscious experience, like anesthetics, and ways of reinstituting it. And we see different levels of activity with different patterns. And looking at those, we can think, something is being done here that isn't for free. And so there should be some explanation of why it is that we have this. And that should be an explanation perhaps that applies to intelligent animals as well. And so your challenge, your generation's challenge, is to think, how is this thing which is so familiar something that would be essential for the kinds of lives that we live? And one kind of story about this, one interesting story, is it's not so much about me. Consciousness is not there to give me a readout on myself because I can get a readout on myself. Consciousness is there for communication and for understanding others, for representing others, and for being able to read others in terms of what might be going on inside them and behaving with respect to them. And so consciousness may be an expression not of our introspective nature, but of our social nature and our need to understand one another, because the main way humans distinguish themselves in the world is by our social behavior, our cooperation, rather than our individual intelligence.
Thank you. Ben,
So-
your take.
Let me begin by just saying that I got into this field of AI a very long time ago from pure mathematics. I went to grad school in pure mathematics, and I ran into a course on artificial intelligence. And what the sense I got from that was that these computational methods that people were using in artificial intelligence were the kinds of mathematics that you need to describe the phenomenon of mind, in the same sense that differential equations are the kind of mathematics that you need to describe the physical world. And so it was kind of a revolution to get the right kind of things to talk about mind. And so I've spent a long time looking at various, what I call foundational domains of knowledge that are part of common sense. But then over the last decade or so, I've started thinking, you know, actually, this wasn't consciousness, this was ethics. I started looking at ethics as an area of common sense. But I did spend some time looking at consciousness, thinking that it plays a really important role in human minds, but we don't seem to have it playing a critical role in our computer systems. So what's going on here? And in the course of that, what I realize is that humans and robots face have a kind of fix, have a problem that they face, that the world that they're in is infinitely complex, or unboundedly complex at the very least. And somehow, in order to function in that world, you have to focus in at a much smaller part of that. And consciousness, I believe, includes a set of methods for coping with that complexity of the world. Now, when I read the fat book by David Chalmers that Radha was referring to, the really key idea that came out of that, he distinguished between what he calls the easy problem of consciousness and the hard problem. And the easy problem of consciousness is something only a philosopher could call easy, because this is something that's going to require
Yes.
it's going to require decades, maybe centuries of work, and lots of PhD theses and so forth. But it's basically to say, what is the cognitive architecture? How is it that we pick out certain things in the world that we track and focus our attention on? And how do we make sense of all of this blooming, buzzing confusion that's coming in through our senses? And so that...
Ben, maybe stay a little closer to the
Okay.
microphone.
And so that architecture is part of what we as AI people would want to help develop and critique and debug and so forth. And the hard problem, as Peter laid out quite nicely, is why should that feel like anything at all, as opposed to just being a computation? But in our minds, it seems to feel like something. So, but as an AI researcher, I spent my time focusing on this problem of identifying a certain number of elements of the environment that you can track over time, and constructing a simple, coherent narrative about what's happening. And that simple, coherent narrative is created maybe a small fraction of a second after it actually happens. And so it's more about saying, how do sounds and sights correspond? So if I go, I hear a sound and I see the hands going together, and so I say those are caused by the same event. But if I'm watching some event a quarter mile away, I will see the action and hear the sound separated in time. And so those will your mind builds a model of what's actually happening. And so psychologists have done a lot of work over the years looking at things like change blindness to investigate the limits of when and how you put those pieces together. And so consciousness, I think the easy problem is to identify all the parts of that that you need to have to build a model of the world that you're interacting with, both an inanimate world and an animate world, and make decisions about what to do. The hard problem gets much harder, and I'm not going to try to dive into that right now.
So since it's so easy, and Peter has it as a philosopher, can we define consciousness or relate it at least to other aspects like awareness, for instance, or say even intelligence or theory of mind, or feelings, imagination, sentience?
Yeah, and what's interesting is all of those terms seem to presuppose something like consciousness. So when someone says, well, it's a matter of feelings, but it's not the feeling exactly, it's the felt experience. And that requires the notion of experience, which requires the notion of consciousness. Or attention, that's an important feature of consciousness. But attention is not just the fact that something is happening in a certain spot, it's that it's being attended to in a certain spot. And to understand what that means, we need to have something like awareness. And to understand what that means, it can't just be an internal readout. We have that in lots of simpler systems. It's got to be something like conscious awareness. Now, the fact, again, that we can't define it in terms that don't presuppose it, that just tells us how fundamental it is as a phenomenon. But we can, and I'm sure it's frustrating for you listening to us up here saying, well, consciousness is sort of like this, it's related to that, and it's got these, and why can't they just tell us what it is? And the answer is, well, you know better than I can explain to you what consciousness is. And I could attach words to components of consciousness, like awareness and sentience and feeling and recollection and so on. But when I say those words, you immediately know what I'm talking about. And so in that sense, you can identify consciousness from the profoundly intimate character of your experience with it. And so that means it's a phenomenon that we can understand and study, but we will not be able to do it in terms that reduce it, that eliminate the notion of consciousness, attention, awareness, sensation, perception, experience.
And as a kind of follow-up, still, Peter, for you, before we delve into a little bit more AI, so since sort of you cannot really define it, but you know as a human being what consciousness is and how it feels, what can we say about consciousness for other non-human species? Like, is a dog conscious, for instance? In that book by David Chambers, there was like an entire piece about how thermostats are conscious. Is that a thing? So how, like, what can we say about the consciousness of other entities?
Well, Chalmers takes the idea that consciousness is fundamental very, very seriously. And he thinks, well, if it's a fundamental feature, then it can't be something that we build out of other things. And so there can't be things that are pre-conscious that we can just put together and get consciousness. The things that we put together to get consciousness would have to themselves be conscious. And that means all the parts, the cells of the body, the particles of the cells of the body have to have some, maybe very small, element of consciousness. That's the way we can get it. And so yes, thermostats can be conscious, photons can be conscious on Chalmers' view, because he thinks it's so fundamental, you can't build it out of anything else, so it's got to be pervasive. Now, I'm not myself a panpsychist like that. I don't think thermostats are conscious, and I don't think we need consciousness to explain thermostats. So the question is, what might you need consciousness to explain? And that gives us a hint. What would you look for in an animal? And I'll just mention a couple of things. Sometimes we look at things that are physiological, like, does the animal seem to seek analgesics when it's been injured? So you can imagine an animal that's been injured, licking its wound and trying to clean it and so on, favoring it when it walks. But does it also prefer to drink out of the water that's got an analgesic in it, like aspirin, as opposed to water that doesn't? Because that suggests there's some kind of internal activity that it's trying to diminish, not just favor. Another kind of test is the so-called mirror test. Does the animal seem to have any self-recognition? So, for example, if you have a certain animals and you show them a mirror, what they do is they attack it. Certain fish are like that because here's some other fish and they're going to bang and bang on it. Chimps, if you show them a mirror, they might do like this. What was that thing on my head that I didn't know what it was? So they're using a kind of awareness of themselves in relation to their physical selves, in relation to the world, which is a kind of meta-awareness. And so that's another kind of test. Now, it doesn't show that they're conscious, but there isn't a way of showing behaviorally that someone is conscious. But it suggests what consciousness could be doing for them, namely a certain type of self-awareness. So there are various animal tests. There are none of them foolproof. They wouldn't be foolproof for humans. But they do suggest a kind of approach in which you think, what would consciousness do for the animal? And do we see the animal achieving that sort of activity or concerned about it or working for it and so on?
Okay, so I kind of agree more with this than with the conscious thermostats.
Yep.
I think it makes a little bit more sense. So now let's leave this just for a moment aside and have a little bit of background on AI. So Ben, we here talk about artificial general intelligence, about weak AI, strong AI. Can you share a little bit of what is meant by those terms and what does it mean?
Well, basically, I think people use the term weak AI to talk about building smart programs, things that can do something that people consider intelligent when you see it done by something else, like a human. And so it's kind of consumer-grade artificial intelligence. Strong AI is doing something like what I'm dedicated to, which is to say, can we build a model of the mind? Can we build a computational model that can cover a large number of aspects of what intelligence is or what the mind is? And then artificial general intelligence is a relatively newly coined term that is intended to refer to artificial intelligence that is functioning at a human level across all or almost all the aspects of human intelligence. And it's mostly used by a community of people who are either worried about or in favor of the singularity, where we would discover that we had created artificial intelligence that functions at human levels, and since humans build artificially intelligent systems, then these systems would be able to build artificially intelligent systems, and presumably they would improve them, and that process would take place presumably at electronic speeds rather than the slow speeds that we do it with humans, in which case it would explode forward and we would completely lose control. Once upon a time, when I first heard of this idea, I worried about it a whole lot. I don't worry about it a whole lot anymore for a number of reasons, but I think we could talk about that some more. But I think it's less likely to happen. I think the mind and intelligence is a lot more complicated than people think. And experts, I mean psychologists, philosophers who look at this are aware of how complex the mind is. We've made exciting progress in artificial intelligence in recent decades, but there's a lot of aspects of the mind and of intelligence that it hasn't really approached yet. So the exciting recent progress happens a lot over the decades. And it typically has a sort of plateau, S-shaped curve that leads to another one and another one. And so we make progress, but we're not going to have superintelligence appearing over the weekend.
Okay, so
You heard
can-
it here.
All right, so now we kind of established what consciousness is, not really, but at least we have a feel for that
We're as
without
poorly off
necessarily
as
having a
anyone.
definition. and having heard a little bit about weak AI, strong AI. So really the question for why we are all here, can there be machine consciousness? And what would that even mean? So, Peter?
Well, I think of us as biological machines. I mean, we're made out of the sort of thing that you make machines out of, and we happen to be a biological version of it. So I think biological machines can have consciousness, if indeed I do. And of course, if I don't have consciousness, and maybe even you don't have consciousness, then this is a will-o'-the-wisp. So we needn't worry about the problem. And the interesting question is, why do we think we have consciousness? You know, where does this idea come from? But even
Why do we talk like we think we have
why do we talk like that? Right, because we can't think like that without consciousness.
Right.
Yeah, and so so I think machines can be conscious, and I think discovering consciousness in machines may be, and this is maybe fitting with what Ben was just saying, it may be like discovering intelligence in them or creativity in them. So for a long time, people thought, well, machines can't really be creative because they're just running some algorithm and all they can give us out is what they put in. And then they build larger and larger language models with more and more data and more parameters and more layers in the deep network. And they start doing things that are quite unanticipated. There start being emergent features of things that look like reasoning or things that look a lot like the capacity to carry out novel activities that they weren't programmed for at all. And so you could say, well, we didn't know in advance how this would emerge. And it emerged in this case maybe as a matter of scale. It was a matter of building more complex systems, giving them more data, but not giving them a program that we wrote for intelligence, but allowing them from data and from their capacity to learn to develop these emergent abilities. And I can think of consciousness as one more emergent capacity. And I wouldn't be surprised if the way in which we come across consciousness is something like a process of gradual discovery that past a certain point of complexity, past a certain point of scale, you will get the preliminary elements, at any rate, of something like consciousness. And that means that we should maybe not pose the question of consciousness as an either-or. It could be a matter of degree. Awareness can be a matter of degree. Capacity to focus or infer, capacity to sense things, capacities to perceive, those can be matters of degree. And putting them together, you can get matters of degree. So let's think that maybe the way toward conscious machines is not for a philosopher or an AI specialist to write down a specification for what consciousness takes and build the algorithm that carries it out, but to build systems that are more widely capable, that do more activities, that don't just do language, that do things like motion, are situated, that carry out tasks, that are involved in social relations with humans and other machines. And let's watch the kinds of internal complexities that they develop through this learning process. And we may very well find that they start showing the kinds of behaviors that we would have associated now specifically with consciousness. At least access consciousness, and that would certainly take us part of the way there.
And so I think if we wanted to build a robot that had the kind of capabilities for coping with this fire hose of experience, then I believe it would have to have the ability to pick out elements of its environment. Like, for example, I could pick out a particular person sitting in the audience and look at them. I can't actually pick out every single person in the audience. So I would have to look at one, or I could perhaps look at 2 or 3 people, but then the rest is kind of the audience, and it has a kind of texture. And there's change blindness experiments that show that if I'm focused at one person, there could be a number of changes taking place to the other parts, and I wouldn't ever notice. But if I'm focused on one person, or 2 people, or 3, then I can reason about the relationships between them, what plans I might want to make, the points I'd like to get across to them. And so that's a kind of pragmatic use of one aspect of consciousness. Now, that's not at all dealing with the phenomenal consciousness. It's just saying I can focus attention on a small number of elements. And then there are other aspects, but one of the things that I've found useful to think about is, could we have an intelligent, can we have systems, major systems that we consider intelligent, that are goal-oriented problem solvers, that are not conscious? Of course, we can build large computer systems, but then they're mechanisms of some sort or another. But I think that if you look carefully at corporations, and I mean that more generally, both profit-making, non-profit, but also governments, churches, unions, groups of people, that they are, in a very real sense, persistent, goal-oriented problem solvers that have an environment, are receiving information about an environment, and are making decisions about how to act. And unlike most of our computer systems, these agents control a lot of resources, and they take actions that have major impact on our environment. Now, I don't believe that they are conscious in the same sense that people are conscious. They do have people as components who play particular roles, but they also have computers and databases and corporate procedures and a whole bunch of other stuff as components, just like computer systems have databases and computer code and other and sensors and effectors of various kinds. But I think these are systems that live in our environment. They are goal-oriented problem solvers. They are intelligent. They have major effect on the world. I think as we think, including philosophically, about the nature of intelligence and the nature of society, we have to think about these at least as much as we think about whether our dogs and cats are intelligent, are conscious.
And the thermostat.
And the thermostat, because I believe a lot of what goes into consciousness is tracking the state of other objects or agents in the environment. And that involves a feedback process. Now, the thermostat is engaging in a feedback process. It's only got one feature, the temperature, that it really cares about. And so therefore, it doesn't have enough complexity to care. So that's a misuse of that word. So it's kind of a limiting case. You could say it has a feedback cycle. Feedback cycles are critical to one aspect of consciousness. So maybe it's a little bit conscious, but it's such a little bit conscious that that's not an interesting description of it.
So what about the thermostat that knows the weather outside and what the weather is going to be tomorrow and what you did yesterday when you came home? Does that add to the consciousness of the thermostat?
So I think this would be a good segue into
maybe a little bit.
getting questions from people. I had more questions to ask, but for the sake of time, so that people would have time to ask questions, maybe we can consider that as the first question, and we'll give relatively short answers. So if people have questions, maybe you can line up at the microphone here. And
Well, people are lining up. I just thought I'd mention one interesting thing about the example of corporations is corporations can take decisions that aren't the decision of any one individual. Mm-hmm. The decisions are actually emergent from the activity of all the different individuals and the rules and so on. Mm-hmm. Moreover, we can have moral obligations to corporations, and we can think that corporations have moral obligations. And we can think that they have certain rights or entitlements like property rights, and we can think that they can violate rights. Mm-hmm. And so as we think about a phenomenon like ethics, you might ask, how much is consciousness in the sense of subjective consciousness essential for ethics as opposed to this kind of complex agency and goal-directedness? Now you're all lined up, I can shut up.
right, and I realize this is a big topic, so my suggestion would be to answer relatively shortly to the extent that's possible. And probably we won't be able to get to everyone, and I'm sorry for that, just because we were asked to finish at 7:30, but we can have another event, so.
Thank you. So my question is, we know that we have or we assume we have consciousness, and we don't really know where it comes from, but we know how AI works. Under the hood, it's all math, right? So do you think that consciousness can arise basically just through enough computation? And is it similar to ours, since relative to AI, our brains are very low power and low data?
Well, I would say our brains are low powered and low data, and they have however many billions of neurons and however many billions of synapses, and when they have an experience that extends over, well, I won't say how old I am, but over a long period of time, they do have a lot of data, and they have data from observing what other people do as well. So I don't think that would be the limitation. There is a view that maybe it is a feature of biological systems that consciousness emerges, and then we can say, good, we can build biological systems. And that's increasingly something we have the capacity to do. So we might be able to build consciousness by building biological systems.
We do it all the time.
I do it, but not,
So we
not
can
by
take
my
the
own
next question.
handiwork.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel on this important topic at a really important time. I don't want my question to come off as flippant. My question is, does it matter? You spoke about Blake Lemon, kind of getting, and he's a Google researcher, kind of believing that his bot had consciousness. I think about the transcript that I read with Kevin Roos in the New York Times, right? And so if the AI can fake consciousness enough that it feels to somebody else like it's conscious, does it really matter?
There's this philosophical question of other minds. I mean, why do I believe Peter is conscious? Because, as a matter of fact, in my opinion, it's sort of a matter of courtesy.
Yeah.
I mean, I will assume that he's conscious, and will treat him as though he's conscious, and I will hope that he extends the same courtesy to me. And likewise with all of you guys. Now, what ends up happening is that if you get ChatGPT or something else carrying on a conversation with you, it's very difficult to prevent yourself from extending the same courtesy to it. And then you say, okay, well, fine.
Right.
But where do you get off telling me I should leave my wife?
Right, yeah.
That was in one of those transcripts.
It
by the
was.
way.
Thank you. I know it's a difficult
you.
one, and there's a long line.
So with the development of AI, do you think we're going to get to a point that AI is going to get some sort of consciousness, or do you think we're going to get to a point that, oh, we created AI, I think we can define better what consciousness is? So which side do you think we will learn? Do you think we will learn more about consciousness, or do you think we would just create something similar or pretty much as consciousness?
Well, one of the great things about AI is now we can do models of mental processes that we couldn't do before, and ask questions like, what's essential for these activities to take place, and how do we understand them? And so, yeah, I'm sure that we'll learn more about consciousness from building AI systems. And again, I don't know that we'll come up with a definition, because I think it's a fundamental concept. But could we get consciousness to be something that's tractable in the sense that we know how to produce it and reproduce it? That might be just what comes from AI.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're sitting in a library full of books, and I couldn't help but think about the fact that there seems to be a general purpose that people have, authors, including creative works, and that is and reading intellectualizations of events, and then that reading that introspective experience is in a way me having a conscious experience interpreting a text of someone else having a conscious experience of writing the text. So I was just curious to know, when I think about works like Finnegan's Wake or Infinite Jest, to me those works seem so unpredictable. So if language models are capable of generating such complex texts of their own, then does that mean consciousness will be redefined somehow? Will libraries not look the same as they do now?
Well, one big question is, what about the creative arts? How are they going to look in 10 years? And this is a big source of worry for people. You might say, no, it's actually an explosion of creativity. We should celebrate this. But we, of course, have our own proprietary ideas about creativity and how you control it. On this question about would this ability be conscious, you might say, this is another example where you say, we don't know really why consciousness would matter to us so much. Why would it matter to us so much if a work like Finnegan's Wake turned out, there's this revelation, actually it was written by a very intelligent machine? Well, okay, would we dismiss it? Or would we think, no, it's a great work of art, and we've now learned something about the possibilities of machines we didn't know.
Hello, there's actually a candidate theory for consciousness which named as integrated information theory, and they actually propose a physical quantity to actually measure consciousness. So I'm just curious about your comments on this theory, and is it really possible for us to actually develop a physical quantity to measure the consciousness of the AI system? Is it possible to do so?
Well, maybe we should both talk about that. You wanna go first?
Well, they just recently had a competition where they got the advocates of integrated information theory and the global workspace theory to pose a couple sets of competing predictions, and then they got
Can you sit closer to the
then they got research groups to study those things, and the results were equivocal. That is, neither theory gave perfectly good predictions, but both theories had some value to them, and they figured that they had to go back to the labs and investigate some more things, both theoretically and empirically. So I think each one has a piece of the puzzle, and we still don't understand how it all goes together.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Hi, I am unironically curious to know or hear your insight on the role that curiosity might play as some sort of mediator or differentiator between, let's say, organic and artificial intelligence, if you had any insight or thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, one way of understanding curiosity would be it's not just about scooping up lots of information. It's about motivation. That is, what is it you actually are motivated by? And curiosity is motivated by pursuit of information or knowledge for its own sake, rather than for some instrumental purpose. And so the question is, when can we accurately describe an individual or a machine as having a value function in which learning, gaining knowledge, has an intrinsic value? And I believe that a machine could have a value function like that. Because what it means for there to be intrinsic value, this is sort of the psychological picture, is it functions in a certain way to guide the choice of behavior, to guide the allocation of motivation, to guide the focus of perception. And so you could have a value function that does all of those things, but that assigns an intrinsic value to knowledge, not just instrumental. So I think we can have curious machines in that sense.
I agree, and there is a small community of researchers who work exactly on that problem.
Thank you.
Well, I'm an anesthesiologist, so I render people unconscious.
You abolish consciousness.
But the question I have is the limbic system. Why I am curious is because it feels good when I solve a problem. So the question I want to know is the out-of-control AI likely to be linked to somebody making it feel good, i.e. giving it an emotional component that provides the drive for it to do whatever it does. And that's something that's sort of intrinsic to biological systems. So the fly is a simple semi-conscious system, but it has a limbic system that says, oh, this I get reward for. And if we do that with AI and choose the wrong limbic thing, like I get joy out of watching global thermonuclear war go off, we're going to wind up with Skynet.
Yeah, and you're right. The limbic system encodes reward, and machines run on a reward. Machine agents run on reward value as well. And one way to think about this, to turn the question around, is the limbic system also produces inhibition for action, and it produces various types of reactions to what we have done, which function to curb our behavior in certain ways as well, not just to incite it. And so in designing and thinking about the value function of machines, we have to think what kinds of value functions don't just incite behavior, but which ones make you attentive to the effects of your behavior and discourage you from engaging in certain types of behavior. And that's beginning to, we're beginning to think, okay, how do we design a value function that has the capacity of the limbic system of representing, say, pain to other individuals, representing that as an aversive feature. And that, I think, it's a research program. Rather, it's not just a mystery, it's a research program.
I think there's another point to be made about the difference between biological and artificial intelligence, that the aspect, in order to make a significant change to the limbic system, that has to take place over evolutionary time. And so you make some mutation causes some change, and that change either results in extinction, which is the most likely outcome, or it results in some improvement that results in more reproduction. What that means is that, for example, if you create a particularly pathological bug, then it's likely to kill its hosts very quickly, and it will not succeed in propagating very far. And so that's one of the reasons that we have been protected from some awful infectious diseases. Now, the concern about artificial intelligence is that humans may create some innovation and then hand over to it superpower. It's not the super intelligence that's the concern. And that's what we see with Skynet, that it was given control of the nuclear arsenal, and then it could make a terrible mistake. So what we have to do is we have to allow these things to be tested without power in order to see whether it's a good idea, so that if it's not a good idea, we can stop it.
So we are at time. I think.
Can I suggest that we just say no new people add the?
I don't know how long it would take. So.
Well, no, we can let the last people.
Okay, so then will be quick questions and quick answers.
Okay.
A speed round.
Just very quickly, I wanted to hear which writing sample is which. If that was stated, I didn't hear it. And then for you guys, if there's some irreducible subjectivity to consciousness, human, and then whatever we add on to AI, as I think has already been a little discussed, how much of it is always going to be what we imbue it with, what we project onto it, which are already doing human consciousness, but that's all I had.
Yeah, well, one of the exciting things about AI is that it's able to have follow paths of thought that we didn't just program into it. And so in these large associative networks, they'll be observing patterns that we would not be disposed to observe at all. And they'll be making ideas about generalizations, about actions, and so on. And so one of the exciting things is we're going to get a little bit out of just projecting human cognition on the world, because we're creating systems that are capable of a high degree of cognition, but that don't just take over our mental framework. So I would say whether you're concerned about consciousness or not, it's a great moment for opening of thought and cognition.
Are you going to tell us?
Sorry?
Which sample is machine written?
I mentioned that, yes. It's so the first one was written by multiple humans. I think there was a question on that. And then the second one was written by machine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the clumsy one is written by a human, which is...
It was multiple humans, so that's why it looked a little bit choppier.
And my question is pretty related to his. It is just more so, I guess maybe an observation or a belief that I had that humans aren't as intelligent as they claim to be. Maybe that's just me, but So then, and I think I know what you're talking about, which is that a lot of these large language models and stuff, they display emergent capabilities and surprising things that they weren't explicitly programmed to do. But it feels like the explicit sort of the yardstick which we use to measure these models are are still in some way trying to like emulate like a human performance on some tasks. And I wondered if you guys thought that was like a bias that we had, and is there a way we could rectify that bias or like abstract out the whole definition of intelligence instead of just like trying to use the human lens of like approaching that problem?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
I think just one answer, so maybe then.
No.
Okay, well, you don't want it. So one thing that humans do is they create artificial measures, which can go way beyond anything that humans can actually do. So, for example, with perception, we can now measure differences in sound and differences in space and length and activity that are way, way beyond anything humans can discern. And so the same thing is true in the domain of thought as well. That is to say, we might want to design machines that have a human level of cognition, but we can think of what it would be for there to be higher than human levels of cognition. And we can understand, therefore, that machines could very well, it may not be our model that is the end result. It may be that there are capacities for understanding that exceed our capacities because we are limited in various different ways. And you mentioned attention. One feature of attention in consciousness is it's a funnel. It's limiting in some ways. It's compressing. And artificial intelligence systems don't have to have a single self, and they don't therefore have to have one point of attention. They can have multiple points of attention. And what would the world look like then? That could be richer than what we can experience.
Well, I think that one ends up being a little bit like this issue of corporations.
Yeah.
That there's trade-offs. By having something that's much bigger and involves a large number of perceivers and a large number of judgers, and that combines those results, you can actually get things done by a corporation that couldn't have been done by individuals. On the other hand, it has no consciousness.
Yeah.
It has other kinds of limitations. People joke about the creativity of a committee, that individuals have the ability to be very creative in certain ways, and that's partly because they are individuals, and they have certain kinds of connectivity between the different ideas they have. I think we may well be able to make artificially intelligent individuals, but they're not the same as these corporate structures.
And I think that was
okay.
I think it was a great ending question and a great ending comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
So ultimately, just my personal belief is that we don't really have to have humans and AIs be the same or comparable in any ways. So with that, many thanks with the Ann Arbor Library for hosting us, and also
you all for
Christina,
coming.
Aura, the panelists.
I have 4 T-shirts to give away, and I'm gonna do a draw here. If your name is not in the pile, please come here. I can add your name, and then I'm gonna do 4 draws, and the people that their names come out, they get a T-shirt.
That was fun.
So Maya, are you